Three HOA bullies made the biggest mistake of their lives when they laid hands on my wife Sarah on our own property. They saw a quiet landscaper who kept to himself. What they didn't know was that this landscaper spent 8 years as a Marine Force Recon operator. And nobody, absolutely nobody, touches my family and walks away. Hey everyone, before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches and how many of you have dealt with power-hungry HOA bullies yourselves. My name is Jake Mitchell, and this happened in our suburban neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona. Sarah and I bought our dream home 4 years ago. It wasn't a mansion, just a nice 3-bedroom ranch with a decent yard where Sarah could practice her photography and I could work on my landscaping business. The neighborhood was perfect. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and what we thought was a reasonable HOA that kept property values stable. I'm not the type of guy who talks about my military service much. 8 years in the Marines, 3 deployments, came home with some scars, and a lot of memories I'd rather forget. After I got out, I started Mitchell Landscaping Services. It was honest work, peaceful work. I could be outside, work with my hands, and help people make their properties beautiful. Sarah supported me completely. She's a freelance photographer specializing in real estate, so we made a good team in the home improvement world. The HOA seemed normal at first. Monthly newsletters, annual meetings, standard rules about keeping lawns maintained and not parking RVs in driveways. The fees were reasonable, and the board members seemed like regular neighbors just trying to keep the community nice. That all changed when Margaret Whitfield decided to run for HOA president. Margaret was one of those people who thrived on control. She was a retired corporate manager who apparently missed having people to boss around. When she got elected, she immediately announced her vision for elevating neighborhood standards and ensuring strict compliance with community guidelines. Within 2 months, she had tripled the list of violations, hired a property management company, and worst of all, created what she called the Neighborhood Compliance Team. This team consisted of 3 guys who had way too much time on their hands and apparently watched too many cop shows. There was Brad Stevens, a wannabe tough guy in his 40s who worked part-time at a security company and acted like he was some kind of federal agent. Then there was Kevin Walsh, a gym rat who'd never seen real action, but loved flexing his muscles and intimidating people. Finally, there was Danny Price, the youngest of the 3, maybe 30 years old, who seemed to get off on having any kind of authority over others. These 3 clowns started patrolling the neighborhood like they were Navy SEALs on a mission. They carried clipboards, wore matching polo shirts with HOA enforcement embroidered on them, and strutted around like they owned the place. They'd measure grass height with rulers, take photos of trash cans left out 5 minutes past pickup time, and peer over fences looking for violations. At first, Sarah and I just rolled our eyes and ignored them. Our property was always well maintained. I'm a landscaper, for crying out loud. My yard was probably the nicest on the street. But these guys seemed to have it out for us from the beginning. Maybe it was because I didn't kiss their rings when they introduced themselves. Maybe it was because Sarah had the nerve to question one of their violation notices when they claimed our garden hose was improperly stored for being coiled next to our garage. The harassment started small. They'd walk by our house multiple times a day, always finding something to photograph or measure. They sent us a violation notice because Sarah's car was parked 3 inches too close to the sidewalk. Another notice because our house numbers weren't the approved font, even though they'd been there since we moved in and were identical to half the houses on the street. I tried to handle it diplomatically. I called Margaret Whitfield and explained that her enforcement team seemed to be targeting us unfairly. She gave me some corporate doublespeak about ensuring all residents receive equal attention and maintaining community standards. I could tell she wasn't going to rein in her goon squad. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was inside on a conference call with a potential client, discussing a major commercial landscaping project. Sarah was outside in our front yard taking photos of some spring flowers that had bloomed in our garden beds. She was working on a portfolio piece about suburban nature photography. I was about 20 minutes into my call when I heard raised voices outside. At first, I figured it was just neighbors talking, but something about the tone made me look out the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. Sarah was standing near our mailbox, camera in hand, surrounded by all 3 members of the enforcement team. Brad Stevens was waving a clipboard in her face. Kevin Walsh was standing way too close to her personal space, and Danny Price was pointing aggressively at our house. Sarah looked confused and frustrated, trying to back away, but they kept moving closer. I ended my call mid-sentence and headed for the door. By the time I got outside, the situation had escalated. Stevens was now grabbing at Sarah's camera, claiming she was photographing HOA enforcement activities without permission. Sarah was trying to protect her equipment. That camera cost $3,000 and was her livelihood. "Ma'am, you need to surrender that device immediately." Kevin Walsh was barking like he was some kind of federal agent. "You're interfering with official HOA business." "Official business?" Sarah shot back. "I'm taking pictures of flowers in my own yard." That's when Danny Price made his big mistake. He grabbed Sarah's wrist to try to take the camera away from her. She pulled back instinctively and he yanked harder. I heard her gasp in pain. I don't remember crossing the yard. 1 second I was on my porch. The next second I was standing right behind Danny Price. 8 years of Marine training doesn't just disappear because you start carrying a clipboard instead of a rifle. "Take your hands off my wife," I said quietly. My voice was calm, but anyone who'd served would recognize the tone. It wasn't a request. Danny spun around, still gripping Sarah's wrist. Up close, I could see he was one of those guys who'd never been in a real fight in his life. All gym muscles and 0 combat experience. "Sir, step back," Brad Stevens commanded, puffing out his chest. "This is official HOA enforcement business." I looked at each of them slowly, the way I used to assess threats in Fallujah. "Official business doesn't involve putting hands on my wife in my own yard. Release her wrist and step away." Kevin Walsh stepped closer, trying to intimidate me with his size. "You need to control your wife, buddy. She's interfering with our investigation." "Investigation?" I almost laughed. "Into what flowers growing in our landscaping?" That's when Danny Price made his second mistake of the day. Instead of letting go of Sarah's wrist like any reasonable person would do, he tightened his grip and shoved her backward. She stumbled and would have fallen if I hadn't caught her. The switch flipped. 8 years of Force Recon training took over. I moved faster than any of them expected. My left hand shot out and grabbed Danny's wrist, applying just enough pressure to a nerve cluster to make him release Sarah immediately. He yelped in pain and tried to swing at me with his free hand. I deflected the punch easily and drove my palm into his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping for air. Kevin Walsh rushed me from the side, probably thinking his gym workouts made him tough. I sidestepped and used his momentum against him, grabbing his shirt and helping him continue his journey face first into our mailbox post. The metallic clang echoed through the neighborhood. Brad Stevens, the supposed leader of this crew, pulled out his phone and started recording. "You just assaulted HOA officials. This is all being documented." "Good," I replied, not even breathing hard. "Make sure you get a good angle of what happens next." Stevens apparently decided his phone was also a weapon, because he swung it at my head like a club. I caught his wrist, twisted just enough to make him drop the phone, then swept his legs. He hit the pavement hard. The whole thing lasted maybe 15 seconds. 3 guys who thought they were tough were now groaning on my driveway, and I wasn't even winded. Sarah had her camera out and was documenting everything. "Are you okay?" I asked her, checking where Danny had grabbed her wrist. There were already red marks forming. "I'm fine," she said, but I could see she was shaken. "Jake, they just came out of nowhere, demanding to see permits for our flower beds. When I said we didn't need permits for flowers, they said I was being uncooperative." Danny Price was still curled up on the ground, whimpering about his ribs. Kevin Walsh was sitting against our mailbox, holding his nose, which was definitely bleeding. Brad Stevens was trying to get up but kept slipping because apparently hitting concrete makes you dizzy. Who knew? "I'm calling the police," Stevens wheezed, finally managing to retrieve his phone. "Please do," I said. "I've been hoping someone would." See, here's what these amateur hour enforcers didn't know. For the past 2 months, I'd been documenting every single interaction they'd had with residents in our neighborhood. I had videos of them harassing Mrs. Patterson, our 78-year-old neighbor, about the color of her mailbox. I had photos of them measuring the exact height of the Johnsons' fence with a tape measure. I had recordings of them threatening the Rodriguez family with fines because their kids' bicycles were improperly positioned in their own driveway. Most importantly, I had installed security cameras around our property after the first violation notice. Everything that had just happened was recorded in high definition from 3 different angles, with crystal clear audio of them grabbing my wife and me defending her. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. The responding officer was Detective Lisa Morrison, a no-nonsense veteran herself, who took one look at the scene and immediately started separating everyone to get statements. Sarah showed her the camera footage she'd been taking. Plus, she pulled up our home security system on her phone. Detective Morrison watched the whole incident play out, including the clear audio of them grabbing Sarah and threatening us. Meanwhile, the 3 stooges were trying to spin their story about how they were just doing their jobs, and I had violently attacked them without provocation. Denny was still claiming his ribs were broken, and he needed an ambulance. Kevin was insisting his nose was shattered and demanding I be arrested for assault. Detective Morrison listened patiently to their version of events, then asked to see the security footage again. She watched it twice, taking notes. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said to the enforcement team. "You approached Mrs. Mitchell in her own yard, demanded she stop taking photos of her own property, then physically grabbed her camera and her person when she refused to comply?" "We were conducting official HOA business," Brad Stevens insisted. "She was interfering with our duties. And what official duties require you to grab a resident's camera and person while they're in their own yard?" Stevens started stumbling through some explanation about photography restrictions and interference with official business, but it was clear he was making it up as he went along. Detective Morrison turned to me. "Mr. Mitchell, can you walk me through your response?" "I saw 3 men putting hands on my wife in our own yard," I said simply. "I asked them to stop. They refused and became more aggressive. I used minimal force to protect my family and remove the threat." "Minimal force?" Danny wheezed from where he was sitting on our driveway. "He attacked us." Detective Morrison looked at Danny, then at Kevin, who was still bleeding from his nose, then at Brad, who had scrapes from hitting the pavement. Then she looked at me, standing there without a mark on me, not even breathing hard. 3 on 1, she mused. "And you're the only one not injured. That's either incredible luck or incredible skill." 8 years Force Recon, I said quietly. "If I wanted to hurt them, they'd be in the hospital, not sitting on my driveway complaining." Detective Morrison nodded slowly. She'd clearly dealt with veterans before and understood the distinction between measured response and actual violence. After reviewing all the evidence and taking statements from Sarah and me, plus several neighbors who had witnessed parts of the incident, Detective Morrison made her decision. Based on the evidence, Mr. Mitchell was defending his wife on his own property against an unlawful detention and assault by these 3 individuals. She announced, "No charges will be filed against Mr. Mitchell. However, I am placing all 3 members of this enforcement team under arrest for assault, battery, and trespassing." The looks on their faces were priceless. They had gone from swaggering around like tough guys to facing actual criminal charges in the span of 30 minutes. But that was just the beginning. Word of the incident spread through the neighborhood faster than a wildfire. By evening, someone had posted Sarah's footage to the neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, "HOA enforcers attack veteran's wife. Get what they deserve." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of neighbors came forward with their own stories of harassment by the enforcement team. Mrs. Patterson shared how they had reduced her to tears by threatening massive fines over her mailbox color. The Rodriguez family posted photos of violation notices they'd received for letting their children play in their own backyard. A young single mother named Jennifer shared how the enforcement team had threatened to have her evicted because her toddler's toys were visible from the street. The most damning evidence came from Tom Bradley, a retired accountant who lived 2 streets over. He had been quietly documenting the enforcement team's activities and had discovered they were issuing bogus violation notices, then pocketing the fine money instead of turning it over to the HOA treasury. They had stolen over $15,000 from residents over the past 6 months. Margaret Whitfield tried to distance herself from the enforcement team, issuing a statement about how their actions didn't represent HOA values, and they had exceeded their authority. But it was too late. Someone had leaked emails showing she had explicitly encouraged them to be more aggressive in enforcement and had promised them bonuses for collecting more fines. The criminal cases moved forward quickly. Denny Price, the one who had grabbed Sarah, was charged with assault and battery. Kevin Walsh got assault charges plus an additional charge of intimidation of a witness because he had threatened to make life difficult for Mrs. Patterson if she reported their harassment. Brad Stevens, as the leader, got all of the above plus embezzlement charges for the stolen fine money. Sarah and I filed a civil lawsuit against all 3 men and the HOA for harassment, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of our civil rights. Our attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres who specialized in HOA disputes, was confident we had an airtight case. The neighborhood rallied around us completely. Residents organized a recall election to remove Margaret Whitfield and the entire HOA board. The vote wasn't even close. They were removed by an 87% margin. A new board was elected with a mandate to completely overhaul the HOA's enforcement policies and ensure nothing like this could happen again. The criminal trials were almost anticlimactic. With clear video evidence and multiple witness testimonies, all 3 men pled guilty to reduced charges. Danny got 6 months in jail and 2 years probation. Kevin got 4 months and 18 months probation. Brad, because of the embezzlement, got a full year in jail plus 3 years probation and had to pay full restitution to all the residents he'd stolen from. Our civil case settled out of court for a significant amount that I won't disclose. But let's just say Sarah was able to upgrade all her photography equipment, and I was able to expand my landscaping business. More importantly, the settlement included a permanent restraining order keeping all 3 men away from our neighborhood and a complete overhaul of the HOA's enforcement policies. Margaret Whitfield resigned in disgrace and moved out of the neighborhood within 2 months. The new HOA board implemented strict oversight of any enforcement activities and established a resident ombudsman position to investigate complaints about harassment or overreach. The best part of the whole story came about 6 months later. Denny Price, apparently not learning his lesson from the first encounter, violated his restraining order by driving through our neighborhood. A neighbor spotted him and called the police. When they picked him up, he was drunk and claiming he was going to finish what we started with Sarah and me. That violation of his probation earned him another 6 months in jail. And this time the judge made it clear that any further contact with our neighborhood would result in serious felony charges. Sarah and I still live in the same house, and we love our neighborhood more than ever. The new HOA board focuses on actually helpful community activities like organizing block parties and maintaining common areas, rather than harassing residents over petty nonsense. Our neighbors look out for each other, and everyone knows that we won't tolerate bullies or people who abuse whatever tiny bit of authority they might have. I still run my landscaping business, and it's grown significantly thanks to referrals from neighbors who appreciated how we handled the situation. Sarah's photography business has also expanded. Turns out a lot of people want to hire the photographer who documented HOA enforcers, getting what they deserved. The incident taught me something important about transitioning from military to civilian life. I had spent years trying to completely leave my Marine training behind, thinking that being a good civilian meant never using those skills. But the truth is, sometimes good people need to be willing and able to stand up to bullies and protect those who can't protect themselves. The key is using those skills proportionally, and only when absolutely necessary. I didn't enjoy hurting those 3 men, but I don't regret it for a second. They put their hands on my wife in our own yard, and they needed to understand that actions have consequences. The fact that their actions had been hurting other vulnerable residents in our community just made it more clear that someone needed to stand up to them. If you're dealing with an out-of-control HOA or power-hungry neighbors who think they can push people around, my advice is this: Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to stand your ground when it matters. Most bullies back down when they realize their targets aren't easy victims. And if you're a veteran struggling with how your military training fits into civilian life, remember that the skills you learned aren't something to be ashamed of. Used properly and proportionally, they can help you protect your family and community from people who would abuse and intimidate others. Thanks for watching this story. And remember to drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. If you have your own HOA horror stories or experiences standing up to bullies, I'd love to hear them. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about people who fought back against abuse of power and won. Until next time, remember, some people need to learn the hard way that actions have consequences.